The room smelled like lemon oil and something expensive that didn't have to explain itself. Light hung in crystal, cold at the edges. The mantel clock rasped its seconds like a small file on softer metal. Staff drifted along prescribed lanes. Donors arranged themselves where cameras could love them. On the walnut coffee table, a pale water ring clung to the grain like a truth kept out of speeches. Veronica Whitfield didn't enter so much as arrive. She wore a white brooch smile and a dress that understood chandeliers. Her hands settled on the back of a leather chair with proprietary grace, fingers quiet, rings ready to catch light. A phone buzzed in her palm and she looked once, only enough to read. Gather near camera in 2. The message blinked and vanished, like a cue swallowed by a professional. Friends, she said, releasing the word into warm air. A little surprise. A server in a black vest came too close to a donor with a fluted glass and got the punishment reserved for the invisible. 2 snaps without eye contact. Leo Alvarez moved to take the tray steady, polite, and the donor added, almost kindly, "Keep him smiling, will you?" The line landed soft and hurt anyway. Rosa stood by the fern near the window, hands folded at the seam of her skirt. She watched her son, and not the room. Presence was a thing you wear when policy tries to take your clothes. Leo, Veronica called, sweet as a bell rung in a hallway you don't own. You play, don't you? Come on, darling. Give-us a demonstration. He turned with the tray still balanced, found her eyes, then the board. The Italian marble looked unbothered by history. The pieces had been set for elegance, not accuracy. Knights faced wrong, a bishop trapped behind a pawn like a bird behind glass. He set the tray down and fixed the arrangement with small, exact touches, centering each piece, as if that were how you teach wood to tell the truth. "Of course, Ms. Whitfield," he said. His voice had a floor. Veronica took the white chair and let a camera see her profile. "My grandfather taught me," she offered to the room. "Tempo is everything." She lifted her glass, checked the wood, and set it down precisely in the center of the pale ring. Hidden, present. A staffer in a navy sheath slid to Rosa's shoulder with a curated smile. "Back of house is that way," she said. "Kester is small. Tone syrup. We'll bring him right back to you." "I'll stay," Rosa answered, turning only enough to be heard. "He plays better when he can find me." "Policy," the woman began. "Presence," Senator Jenna Miles said from the window, not raising her voice. "She stays." The staffer blinked twice and went to find a different policy. Someone murmured about acoustic quality, as if the quartet in the corner were a faucet you could turn. The musicians, adaptive and professional, slipped into a low drone the room could mistake for air. The chandelier cooled a shade, blue ringing the crystal like winter at the edges of a picture. Veronica's fingers touched a pawn with choreography and sent it 2 squares forward. "E4," she said brightly, teaching children how to name shapes. Leo did not nod or correct. He answered, "C5," with the certainty of a hand finding a familiar rail in the dark. A few guests who had once played in college hummed approval into their jackets. A donor raised his phone for a frame and found Elise Hanley already standing where the lens needed silk, her shoulder, a gentle eclipse over optics. "Tell us your favorite," a man said, placating and probing at once. "Fisha, Kasparov, Judith," Leo said. He touched a night just long enough to show it a path and then let it wait. "Isn't that unusual?" Veronica said, smiling, like a portrait. "We adore unusual here." The guard at the door pressed a finger to his earpiece and said nothing out loud. The staffer returned to the threshold, and didn't cross it. The wire inside the wall hummed as if the house had a throat. A donor leaned to a friend. "Look at his hand," he whispered, "soft enough to pass for kindness. Gifted kids always have fast hands." "They have rent?" Arthur Hanley said, not realizing he'd said it aloud. He folded his arms like apology, and let the words be the ones he meant. Veronica's bishop came to C4, elegant and wrong for reasons photographs couldn't capture. Leo built a small shelter with his king's pawn and a knight, the geometry settling around him like a room that admits a new owner. He moved within the time he had, not the time the cameras preferred. "Clock," Arthur asked gently, "to keep things even." "It's a party," Veronica answered. "We don't need to measure fun. It's a game," Leo said, same tone. "No teeth." Somewhere behind the piano, a fork tapped china and apologized for existing. The staffer tried again with Rosa. Smile, formalizing, just for the event. "Mom, donors in donor space. Presents," Rosa said, the syllables soft as starch. "He stays, I stay." "Copy," the guard said into his shoulder, "because habits speak even when orders change." Veronica leaned in, pupils glossy. "Tell me, Leo," she said, making his name smaller than it was, "do boys in your neighborhood play much? Or is this a special talent?" He moved. G6. Like opening a window, no one had noticed. The bishop behind it saw a diagonal that would matter later. He didn't narrate. He let marble and line do the explaining. "Lovely," she said, though she meant photogenic. She sipped, checked the wood again, and smiled at the hidden ring. She couldn't help adjusting the glass until the circle sat dead center. When you live on cameras, you center things until they stop resisting. A donor cleared his throat. 1,000 to Lincoln Elementary. He floated. "If he gives our hostess a scare," laughter scattered like dry leaves. Some of it sounded like approval, some like relief at a sanctioned game. "Make it 2, Veronica said, fingers poised over a night she hadn't yet earned. "We uplift." Rosa's jaw tightened by a degree. Elise saw it and moved a half step so Rosa wouldn't have to. Senator Miles glanced at the guard and then at the ceiling, as if cataloging the exits. Veronica played NFTs 3. "Safe and smart enough for a picture," Leo answered. "I'm 6. With a steadiness that made the chandelier chime at its own temperature. The quartet slid into a two-note figure that sounded like a held breath practicing being polite. A server near the mantel bumped the clock by accident. He straightened it at once with a quiet sorry to Wood. The second hand sprinted, shivered, and found its pace again, embarrassed to be seen. The staffer raised her tablet near Veronica's shoulder, blue light on peril. A caption draft glowed briefly. "Mentorship night. When youth rise, we rise," before her thumb killed it. "Press is asking if this is an exhibition," she whispered. "In my home," Veronica said, "we create teachable moments." She moved her rook to the second rank. "Tidy, photogenic, structurally premature." "Clock," Arthur repeated to the air, but nobody owned the request. Leo's queen slipped to C7 like shade under a door. The wire hum lifted a note. He saw not threat-proof, the kind that accumulates until even polite rooms have to stop pretending they don't hear it. "Fast," somebody said, trying to sound impressed instead of worried. "Prepared," Leo said. He touched his rook to check the centering and left it where it waited best. His fingertips kept still a heartbeat longer than they had to, a pause that made time consider who it belonged to. Veronica's chief of staff edged near Rosa again, dropping the smile. "Ma'am." "Presence," Senator Miles said, without moving. "She stays." The staffer folded the smile back on like a uniform. "Understood." she said to the carpet. Veronica looked up, scanning faces. The way a moderator scans chat, people arranged their mouths in hopeful position. Phones hovered, half guilty. The ring on the wood shone faint and unmovable beneath its perfect circle of glass. She played a bishop to E2 and told the room, structure. She did not look at the open files she'd just ignored. Leo Castle switched with the calm confidence of someone who's been keeping his own time for years, the king tucked behind pawns that had earned their jobs. The rook came toward the C file with purpose and without fanfare. A bar you slide into brackets when a latch isn't enough. Tell us. A donor sang out, a line thrown like a float. What do you want to be? Prepared. Leo said again. He didn't smile. The line wasn't a line. It was inventory. The chandelier cooled further. A draft tickled the fern and gave Rosa a last breath of wet green before the room's money smell took over again. She smoothed the seam of her skirt with a thumb and waited for the part where rooms stop, pretending they can't hear wire. Veronica's phone buzzed against the marble. She glanced. Gather now. The staffer lifted the tablet, eyes brightening to a camera's favorite angle. Donors swelled the quarter step needed to look spontaneous. Veronica set her glass down in the center of the ring and lifted a hand like a conductor finding downbeat. Allez son, she announced, and brought her queen high for the line. Leo didn't watch her arm. He watched the squares. He saw the place where a door could be. Even if someone had painted it to match the wall, he moved a small pawn, a single square. The mantel clock rasped. The chandelier's crystals touched and rang like ice, deciding who they were. The staffer's tablet caught a reflection and made a second room inside itself. Smaller, bluer, honest by accident. Good, Senator Miles said. Not loud, not praise exactly. Veronica smiled another watt. She brought her rook to the second rank and posed it in front of the queen. Bars across a hallway you only notice when you try to run. See, she said, pleased with how the move would look later. Leo placed a fingertip on the crown of his queen, felt the tiny seam there like a scar healed right, and slid the piece one square along a diagonal that hadn't seemed important when the evening began. The wire in the wall hummed. The hinge on the far door sighed without opening. Phones drifted lower, as if gravity had just been adjusted. Tempo, Veronica said brightly, but the word had to work harder to sound like a promise. Rosa did not move. She breathed in for 4 and out for 6 and stood where she could be found. The ring on the table kept its shape under glass. The house cleared its throat again in the timbers. A code old rooms use when it's time to stop lying. The game, obedient to no one, kept going. The quartet lowered to a hum you felt in the teeth. Conversations slid to the board like furniture pushed over carpet. The chandelier cooled another shade and made everything beneath it honest against its will. A staffer in navy stepped to the console, tablet bright as a small moon. She angled its face so the camera could read her boss without seeing her hands. Caption drafts surfaced and sank like fish avoiding a net. Mentorship night, she whispered, when youth rise, we rise. Veronica didn't look fully up. Her eyes zigzagged to the lens and back. She nodded once like someone approving the weather, then centered her glass again as if the ring needed rehearsal. The guard at the archway took 2 soft steps into the room. He lifted a palm toward Rosa, like a crossing guard, trying to keep traffic polite. Ma'am, he said, voice built to be obeyed without echo. Rosa didn't move her feet. She tipped her head a degree and let the word land where it could not root. I stay, she said. He plays better when I can be found. Back of house, the staffer added, smile pressed and ready. Presence, Senator Miles said, eyes on the board as if reading minutes. She didn't turn, didn't raise her volume. The title she carried did the work for her. The guard's thumb grazed his radio. "Copy," he said, "because protocol has its own lung." He drifted back to the arch and watched like a man who knows rooms can change masks. Leo slid his rook one square as if measuring wood, not yet to the file, enough to remind the file it existed. The wire in the wall hummed a fraction louder. An old house showing its arteries. Structure. Veronica announced with a bishop poised above a modest square. "We teach with kindness." Arthur exhaled through his nose and made a small adjustment to his cuff. He had the look of a man who'd paid for the rug and didn't like the stain it hadn't earned. A donor on the far side lifted his phone to film the hostess's smile. He kept the lens tight on profile and pearl, cropping the boy's hands and the woman by the fern. The shot looked generous if you didn't count. Elise stepped where the frame needed silk and happened to block the angle the way a shade saves your eyes. She said nothing to the donor and let fabric be gravity. The phone lowered out of embarrassment, confused for etiquette. Veronica's queen came to E2 and posed like a thing that wanted to be printed. It guarded nothing essential and looked faithful doing it. Leo didn't punish the vanity. He trapped its future. He moved Rook 5 with the patience of a man fitting a bar into brackets. Short sound. True function. No flourish for the camera. The corridor across the middle went from aisle to choke in one practical click. "Lovely," someone said, trying contentment on to see if it fit. Measured. Elisa murmured. Not quite to Arthur, not quite to herself. In the corner, the cellist smiled into the ebony of his instrument like it had just told him a secret worth keeping. The staffer hovered at Veronica's shoulder again. "Press wants to confirm exhibition," she said, scrolling without breathing. "And if the young man is part of our program, in spirit," Veronica said, "we believe in open doors." "Keys," Miles said, and now she moved. She set her glass down, no ring this time. The coaster doing its quiet duty and the staffer's fingers paused over her screen. Leo touched the queen's crown with a fingertip, not to move it, to feel the seam he'd noticed earlier. He counted to 3. Because counting is a lint trap for nerves. Then he slid the king to the corner and let air return to the bishop like a promise kept late. "Clock," Arthur said again, a habit asking for company. "We're among friends," Veronica answered with a smile that didn't quite reach text. She lifted her rook and tried to look like a person uninterested in cameras, while checking where the cameras stood. A hinge somewhere whispered its complaint and then got on with it. The house had learned to keep its body noises down around money, and old metal still forgets. The tiny cry landed between moves and changed nothing and everything. Veronica moved a pawn with careful contempt for geometry. She liked her story more than the squares liked hers. The bishop that had looked poised now looked posed. 1,000 to Lincoln. A donor repeated, bright as a raffle. 2 if he scares you. Make it 3. Another said, quick with cash that always arrives too late to matter. Laughter twitched around the room small. Practiced, dying fast. Leo watched the air near White's king thicken by a fraction. He did not hurry into the space he was being sold. He touched a knight and put it back and let the seconds land where they chose. Rosa saw his shoulders drop by half an inch. She matched his breath with hers, 4 in, 6 out because you teach lungs with example. The fern brushed her sleeve and gave up one last dusk of green. Tell us, Leo, Veronica said, shaping his name as if it were lighter than it was. Do you plan to pursue this? I plan to keep time, he said. He sounded like he'd rehearsed it. He hadn't. The staffer lurched forward with the tablet. Then remembered Elise. Then remembered rules not written down. She typed a new caption in a box, the color of compliance. Kindness in competition. The cursor blinked as if waiting for permission to lie. Arthur stepped closer to the board like a man checking the temperature of a pool he already knew was too cold. "What is that?" a donor asked, eyeing the rook gridlocked with quiet intent. "A corredor," he said. "That's no longer a corridor." He wished the sentence sounded less like relief. Veronica's phone hummed again on the marble. "Snake quick." She glanced without moving her head. "Mike boy, if possible." Her eyes cut to the crew with the lapels and tape. A sound tech began to lift a lav on a thin wire that had worn 100 smiles. Elise turned in the same motion she would use to straighten a hem and shook her head a hair. The tech lowered the mic like a man deciding to let a bird live. "Everyone comfortable?" Veronica asked, pouring warmth as if it grew on trees in rooms like this. "Comfort's expensive," Leo said. His hand rested on wood for a second longer than necessary. Then the Queen found H5, and the diagonal turned into weather. The chandelier's blue deepened until glass felt like ice deciding to be honest. The wire hum threaded through the drone and made the floorboards think of winter. A phone at the back lit with a thread of messages. $1K if he blunders, before its owner thought better and pocketed the bet like a penny. "Play the center." Veronica coached for the room, the way people sing along once the chorus arrives. She moved a piece that obeyed cameras before obeying the board. The move looked like instruction and served as evidence. Leo answered by not answering it. The six sat like a door braced with a chair. It wasn't pretty, it was safe, and safety can look like stealing until you remember it. Keeps people alive. The staffer returned with a new brightness. Press had asked for a quote using "grateful" and "beloved." She showed it to Veronica at an angle that let 3 donors read it too. Miles watched the little circle of approval and smiled into the rim of her glass, like someone who had chosen sobriety as a tactic. Back of house, the guard's radio breathed in a voice, not his. He looked at Rosa, and then at the senator, and then chose to be a person for another 30 minutes. He turned the volume down on the whirl. Veronica arranged her rooks on the second rank, bars on bars, a hotel of safety with no fire exit. She liked the way it photographed from 3 feet up. The bishop, forgotten now, pointed at nothing but history. "Tell me your favorite opener," a donor said, filming his own voice into his own archive. "Silence," Leo said. He wasn't trying to be clever. He was telling the room what it kept ignoring. He slid the rook along the C-file until the deadbolt lay flat and patient. The bishop on G7 stared down a lane. No one on white had checked for traffic. The Queen's angle joined it like an old friend late to a good dinner. "Kindness," Veronica said again, like she could will it into being by repetition. She lifted the glass. She set it down so precisely. The ring disappeared underneath, like a bruise under concealer. A camera clicked and apologized. Rosa flexed her fingers and pressed them flat to the seam once more. Presence can be architecture when policy tries to be weather. She stood and let the room do the math it had been avoiding. Miles's aide leaned in with a whisper about a vote on Tuesday, and the word optics that made the senator close her eyes for half a breath. "Keys," Miles said again, opening them. Then locks. The hinge at the far door spoke once. Short. The room hushed the way rooms do when truth comes dressed as something small. The quartet held a note as thin as wire and looked at one another to know when to stop. Veronica smiled wider and brighter and higher than the day required. "We're having such fun," she announced, which is how hosts negotiate with storm. The phones, trained for weather, rose and hovered. Leo, unhurried by weather or announcement, found the square that turned light on 2 lines at once. He placed the Queen with the soft sound of stone agreeing with water. The C-file didn't close. It committed. "Careful," someone whispered, pretending to talk to him, and finally warning themselves. "Good." Miles said, almost to the hinge, almost to the ring under glass. Her mouth did not smile. The clock rasped another second that belonged to no one and everyone. Pressure didn't burst. It settled. And then, square by square, it began to cost. A red tally light winked alive on a shoulder rig. The camera hummed like a small refrigerator turned toward a richer kitchen. A boom operator edged between chairs and glassware until the gaffer's tape on the floor confessed where the lens had been told to stand. Mike the boy, if possible. The chief of staff mouthed, covering her mic with a palm. She tipped a velvet pouch and let a lavalier slide into view like an apology on a string. The assistant threaded pale wire under his jacket cuff and pretended the choreography was mercy rather than capture. Elise stepped with the casual authority of someone who knows where light goes to lie. Her wrist brushed the assistant's, the wire catching against silk and stopping because good fabric is a boundary you can feel. She smiled in a way that retains employment and said, "He's not on program." Like a fact written on paper no one had the spine to produce. Make it teachable, Veronica breathed, eyes never leaving the board. The whisper arrived, dressed as kindness, and strutted like a cue. Her queen hovered. Not a attack so much as a pose. The kind of move that photographs with moral attached. Leo adjusted the rook a millimeter and let his finger rest. The pause, not theatrical but method. He listened to the board as if it spoke through wood and ceramic and the wire inside the wall. The rook drew a straight line to sense, and sense proved stubborn when rooms tried to negotiate with it. The quartet held a string in half sound. It made the glasses sing in sympathetic halos, small circles of noise nested inside larger circles of wealth. Someone's laugh arrived late and brittle, and broke against the marble like a wave that had never seen a shore. Rosa didn't move. Her hands stayed at the seam of her skirt, where thread had learned her fingerprints. She measured her breath, the way you measure a room you're not supposed to belong to, in honest inches, not permission slips. A donor angled his phone for a narrow portrait of Veronica's profile. The frame excluded the boy's hands and the woman by the fern, as easily as stepping around a puddle. He typed a caption that began with, "Grateful," and ended with nothing that could be argued in court. "Tell us what's happening," someone said, half request, half harvest. Arthur pointed with his chin because fingers would make it look like commentary. "He's closing the middle without saying he is," he murmured, "and she's telling the room she already has." Veronica lifted her bishop like a lesson in hand. It landed on a square the cameras adored and the position tolerated. The second rank stitched tighter, a seatbelt that looks responsible until you need the exit you've just blocked. Leo declined to punish the pretense. He slid the queen to a quieter diagonal and watched two corridors darken by degrees. The move offered no headline, just gravity. And gravity does more work than applause when you leave it alone. The chief of staff's tablet glowed with draft language. "Mentorship night. When youth rise, we rise." Her stylus hovered over, "Rise," as if adding a second would improve altitude. Elise watched the tablet and then the board, and then the ring under glass. Her fingers touched Arthur's cuff once. A pressure valve disguised as affection. Across the room, the guard let his hand fall from the radio and took in a breath that belonged to him, not to the building. "Tempo," Veronica repeated with a smile, too practiced to be new. She brought a rook laterally and reinforced the pretty lie. Safety layered itself into a cage. Bars, crossing bars, each elegant, none tested, fast. A donor said under his sleeve, "Correct," Leo said without looking up. He placed a pawn where it hushed a line like a finger to a child's lips, not scolding, instructing. The boom slipped forward again. Fishing for air, Elise shifted an inch, and the mic kissed silk instead of consonants. The assistant backed off, cheeks pinking, and scribbled a time code on a strip of tape, as if proof could be grafted after the fact. Back of house remains available. The staffer tried again. Voice. At a register, people learn for hotel lobbies and funerals. Rosa lifted her chin by a fraction that didn't register on camera. Presents, she said, and the word found purchase on the walnut like a thumbprint that won't buff out. The chandelier shed one more degree of warmth. Crystal turned honest blue and stopped flattering cheekbones. It threw little prisons of light on the table that the pieces walked through without complaint. Leo lifted his hand and didn't move at all. Silence is a move if you let it mature. In that beat, the room learned which parts of itself were furniture and which parts were bones. He brought the night forward a simple square. It looked like nothing to a lens hungry for narrative. It looked like inevitability to the bishop that now had to admit the diagonal it had been neglecting. Veronica checked the ring beneath her glass without looking like she'd checked it. She centered the circle again until the stain disappeared under symmetry. Her smile sweetened, the way a person sweetens tea when they're out of arguments. "Isn't he marvelous?" someone said. Dangerous because it agreed with itself. Marvels don't need rooms. Senator Miles answered, eyes half-lidded like a cat preparing to move. They need doors. The chief of staff swiveled her tablet toward Veronica for approval. A second caption glittered, kindness in competition. Next to it, a message badge blinked. Press wants B-roll of boy's voice. She muted the notification and hated herself 1 inch. Arthur's phone vibrated, and he silenced it as if the sound were impolite rather than urgent. Pausing pledge is premature. The text preview, read before disappearing into wallpaper. Elise read the line in the flick of his eyes and put her palm to his sleeve again. A human paperweight for a promise about to fly. Veronica moved a pawn in precisely the way the position punished. It made a photo that would live forever, and a weakness that wouldn't. She asked the room, "Do we see the lesson?" And the room tried very hard to be the kind of room that does. Leo slid his rook to C1 with no drama whatsoever. It made the corridor a wall, the wall a fact, and the fact an argument you could not schedule away. He reset his fingers on his knee, and the clock on the mantel rasped a second that arrived on time despite nobody inviting it. A server approached with a tray and a prayer, and clipped the table with a glass. The quickest hand in the room belonged to Rosa, the second quickest to Leo, the third to Elise. The glass steadied with 3 touches and no spill, and something in the room recalibrated what? Capable. Looks like friends. Veronica brightened, catching the moment and dragging it back to a script. 1,000 more to Lincoln for every heart I feel race. Laughter fanned like cards, but several stayed face down, and somebody's jaw found a new angle. The camera panned low across the board for a shot of hands. It caught the ring under glass in a tiny reflected sun, and for a breath, nothing else. The operator tilted up, startled by honesty, and found the hostess's smile, waiting like a porch light set to timer. Leo looked not at her, not at anyone, but at a square where numbers add up without speaking. He drew the queen to the edge of a line she'd been sniffing all along. The bishop behind him exhaled into its diagonal, as if a window had opened on a humid day. "Careful," someone whispered, and it wasn't a threat or a plea or a taunt. It was the body learning the truth a half-second before the mouth. Arthur's breath caught. Elise broke. Miles's did nothing you could track. The chief of staff's stylus hovered, writing nothing. Her tablet showed a half-finished caption over a paused frame where Veronica looked benevolent, and Leo looked like the future refusing to co-sign. She deleted the draft and opened a new note that read only keys and then backspace that too, because some words you don't get to keep if you aren't going to use them. The hinge at the far door groaned again, and then stopped, sobered by attention. The wire under paint sang a thin line that found the quartet's drone and became music by accident. For a handful of seconds, the house remembered itself as timber and nail and settlement, and not as a brand. Veronica set her fingers to the tops of both rooks like a pianist, symmetrically lying. She moved one, then pretended the other would have been just as fine. Options, she said to nobody, and the position shook its head. Leo's touch returned to the rook's crown and confirmed the seam again, proof of manufacture. Evidence of how even perfect things are two halves glued. He breathed in for 4 and out for 6, and remembered a library that smelled like coins and paper, and a clock that lost a minute a day. He put the rook where it had wanted to be since the first quiet mistake, and left it there to do adult work. The donor with the phone found his own reflection in the glass, and lowered the device, as if embarrassed to be caught by himself. He looked at his hands like he'd never noticed they were in the frame. He tucked the phone under a napkin, as if napkins were designed to hide the urge to record rather than the proof of a meal. Teachable. Veronica tried again. Cheer slick as the floor. Proved, Leo said, and the word arrived like a tool, not a verdict. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need the room to hear it to make it true. The board complied by tightening a single notch that only people who still listened to wood heard. 2 exits downgraded to windows. 2 windows reconsidered themselves as pictures. Somewhere in the kitchen a timer dinged and no one moved. Rosa let her hands unclasp for 1 second, and then brought them back together. She watched his shoulders stay low. She watched a vein at his temple decide not to argue with his heart. Miles set her glass down again. Coaster, kissing wood without a ring to earn. Proceed, she said to no one in particular, and maybe to the century. The guard eased his stance, and discovered his weight had been on the wrong leg for 20 minutes. Veronica smiled for a still camera that did not exist, and raised her queen so everyone could see she owned one. She placed it where it defended a story rather than a square. The story would read well in a caption and collapse inside a position that only counts what can carry weight. Leo saw the line that had been there since the opening. It wasn't a trap. It was a hallway he had kept clean. He stepped into it without hurry, light like a man who has already paid for the shoes he's wearing. Proof reached the room, the way dawn reaches a motel curtain through the seam. You forgot to check. Quiet at first, then everywhere. The door at the far end opened on a hush that pretended to be air. 2 HR people entered like punctuation that had practiced walking. A white envelope led the way, clean as a fresh bandage and twice as ominous. They stopped just shy of the carpet's edge. Ms. Alvarez, the taller one, asked to the room, because rooms like this swallow names. Rosa lifted her hand and let it hover half an inch above the seam she'd memorized. Separation packet, the woman said, already sliding boxes into place with a pen. Effective today. Badge return at close of shift. Final wages by direct deposit. Accrued PTO remitted within 72 hours. Benefits coverage through the end of the month. Her voice made kindness sound like policy that had learned how to stand on tiptoe. The quartet paused and didn't admit it. The note they weren't playing hung between crystal and breath. The mantel clock rasped a second and kept going, because that is what the clock can do. Veronica's smile brightened 1 lumen, as if to balance the room. Oh, heavens, she said lightly. Can we not handle that? Later. She brought her queen 1 square forward, as if teaching children how to cross the street. Now is when HR was told, the man said, a sentence he'd said too many times to feel. The staffer with the tablet looked at the envelope, and then down at the caption she'd typed, kindness in competition, and the word kindness seemed to know better. She backspaced until the screen was a white pond. No one had skimmed. Rosa didn't step toward the envelope. She pressed her lips together and breathed in for 4 and out for 6 until the tremor left her fingers. She looked at Leo, and not the paper that would want to live in a file next to her name. Reset, Veronica announced beautifully, as if the word had never been misused. Teach us the alternative. She centered her glass and hid the ring under symmetry, like you can tuck wrongdoing into layout if you do it with poise. Result, Miles said, and the syllables landed square. Her tone didn't rise. Authority doesn't need to when it already owns the stairs. One of the HR people scribbled a note in the margin as if minutes had asked for a witness. Leo looked at the board as if he were reading a receipt. He slid Rook 2 with a click as modest as good news. It cut a line and opened a truth, one rook behind another, a file turning from hallway to freight train. A donor near the bar said, very quietly, "Oh." He wasn't rooting for anyone. He recognized an invoice. Elisa's fingers tightened on Arthur's sleeve, a pressure that formed words he could no longer say about clock. The taller HR officer held out a clear sleeve with a brass clip inside. Badge, she said. The guard at the arch stepped once and stopped like a man who had remembered he could choose. I finished the game, Rosa said, soft and not asking. She opened her tote and tucked the envelope inside, as if it were a wet newspaper. She refused to drip on the floor. Her hand found the library card under the salt of memory and smoothed it flat without looking. Veronica moved a rook laterally and layered bars on bars. The move photographed well and guarded little dot. Her tongue touched her back tooth, as if checking for sweetness that had gone chalk. Arthur shifted his weight. We could pause, he said, trying to make the verbs sound generous. Elise shook her head once. Barely. And the motion said, finish what's true, then fix what isn't. Exhibition rules would allow a redo. A donor offered, attempting diplomacy with a game he had not played since college. We didn't start an exhibition, Miles said. We started a position. Leo rested his fingertip on the queen's crown, felt the tiny seam again, and found Quintif 3. Not a drum roll, not thunder weather. The diagonal opened like blinds and put light where narrative couldn't. The staffer's tablet pinged with a message from press. Confirm. Boy. Part of program. She typed, not enrolled, and then deleted the not because the room she stood in wanted the word to die. She typed spirit and hated her hand for obeying. Rosa accepted the clear sleeve with the brass clip. She unhooked the badge with 2 deliberate movements so her hands wouldn't shake. She held it a second longer than ceremony requires, then set it on the envelope, as if returning a key. After years of locking herself in, Veronica shaded her eyes with a hand that looked humble and had never been. Sweetheart, she said to Leo, would you mind demonstrating another line? She smiled as if she could convince time to let her have both outcomes. Leo didn't look up. He played Rook, one with the surety of a bolt finding the last thread. The rook behind the rook became a bar behind a door, and the door stopped being optional. The boom mic hovered, hungry and then ashamed. The operator pretended to study the grain in the table like it could confess anything that mattered. The wire inside the wall sang its thin song and didn't ask to be paid. Friends, Veronica lifted her glass again, tone bright enough to bleach. If he scares me, Lincoln Elementary gets another 10. The line tried to turn the boy into coins, and nearly succeeded if you looked only at the caption. Elise took a step and incidentally blocked a camera that had aspired to charity. Arthur's phone buzzed. Pausing pledge is premature. Repeated. This time in a thread with names that bought symphonies, he pocketed the device like contraband and wondered when he had agreed to call air. Optics. The taller HR officer cleared her throat on purpose. "Please acknowledge receipt," she said, pointing to a line. Rosa slid the pen to the paper and signed the way you sign at banks full. Readable. Refusing to pretend the day had not happened. A murmur traveled the room. Brave. Tone-deaf. Policy. Teachable. Words that look good on napkins and bad in logs. The guard at the arch looked at Miles and got a nod that let him keep his job and his spine. He lifted his chin once to Rosa and found a new way to stand in rooms he could not afford. Veronica's bishop tried a late theory and ran into math. She placed it defensively and smiled as if defense were a virtue invented that morning. Leo's queen regarded the square, the way a city engineer regards a map routes, loads, failure points, and made the simplest choice that hurt. Kudit. The word infiltration didn't need to be said. The square said it. A donor near the bar exhaled like a man agreeing to a bill he had tried to put off. Reset. Veronica said again, eyes glossy. "We'll call it a lesson." Result. Miles said, not louder, and the HR pen stopped mid-air like a pointer, with nothing to point at. The staffer's tablet dinged once more. A draft went live on a donor's social within seconds, a caption with the correct hashtags and the wrong witness. Elise watched the post rise and then tapped her phone twice and sent a resignation letter she had already written at stoplights. Leo glanced once not at Veronica, not at the HR hand, not at the guard at his mother. She met his eyes and gave a single nod that had raised him. He placed his rook, not a slam, not a whisper, a period on a sentence made of squares. Rixit. The corridor ended. Veronica looked for a door that photographs had promised her and found a wall she had helped paint. "Is there a—" Arthur began, already sure. There wasn't. "No," Elisa said, steady as a level. The quartet's drone thinned to a line that sounded like patience being used up. The man from HR tucked the envelope's flap as if sealing could undo. "Thank you for your service," he said, sincere the way a printed card can be. Rosa took the paper and the clipped badge and the silence that came with both and held them like items that would need to be put away somewhere that wasn't a trash can. Veronica straightened a rook that had not needed straightening. Her hand trembled less than she expected and more than she would admit. She put the tremor to work by adjusting the glass 1 more millimeter to swallow the ring that would not leave. "Exhibition is concluded," she announced, choosing a finish that had never been offered. "No," Miles said. "Game." Leo breathed in for 4 and out for 6 and let the diagonal finish the work it began 10 moves ago. Quet of 3 simple pressure that multiplied in corners. The bishop on G7 fixed its gaze on a corridor that had forgotten to call itself by name. A donor near the door muttered, "It's done," and regretted being correct in public. Arthur rubbed a thumb across the pad of his opposite hand as if erasing a stamp. Elise watched the staffer with the tablet write, "Grateful," and then erase it and then write, "Community," and then close the app altogether. Rosa slid the envelope into her tote and set the badge on top like a coin a child is meant to see. She nodded to the guard, who nodded back, and found, to his surprise, the exchange mattered to him. She looked at the board and allowed herself one thing, pride without noise. "Rematch," Veronica offered, voice brightening with the false hope of unburning. "I insist." "I have school," Leo said, and set his hand on the queen for the last time. With the care a person gives tools that are older than they are, the clock rasped another even second that belonged to no caption. The chandelier clicked as the filament cooled deeper toward honesty. The hinge down the hall remembered to be quiet, and failed. Once, and then remembered again. The board took on its final shape for the room. White's king breathed the kind of air you get in elevators. Black's pieces said nothing and did not need to. The taller HR officer held the door. Rosa remained where she belonged until the move did what it had promised. When she finally stepped, the carpet rose to meet her shoes, like a place that understood late respect. The envelope stayed sealed, the badge stayed visible. The cost, counted square by square, found its total. Phones lit like minnows in a dark pool. Thumbs moved faster than eyes. On a screen near the bar, a thread flashed. $1K? If he blunders, and vanished into a pocket that smelled like citrus and money. The quartet held a single string that felt like a hallway. It made the glasses hum in their own pitch. Somewhere inside the wall, the wire lifted a note as if saying, "Listen," without wasting consonants. Leo set a rook the way a carpenter sets a brace. One square, no flourish. He didn't close the C-file so much as teach it what it already was. "Look at him," a donor whispered, not meaning reverence. "Kid's lightning." Arthur pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "He's weather," under his breath. The way a man admits he left the umbrella in the car. Veronica felt the room lean toward her for a line. She provided it with the same grace she used for napkins. "If our guest gives me a fright, Lincoln Elementary gets 10, she sang, turning tension into currency, because applause likes arithmetic. Laughter skittered across marble with rubber soles. It didn't go far. On a velvet banquette, a second thread opened. "Make it 15, paired with a champagne emoji that looked like an apology that never arrived. Elise's eyes cut to Arthur's phone and back. She didn't need to read to know the tone. She rested her palm on his sleeve, as if quieting a dog who is better than its owner. Veronica moved a rook side to side, bars unbarred. It whispered of safety to people who believe in railings more than routes. The bishop still pointed at yesterday's threat. Leo checked the seam on his queen's crown with a fingertip and breathed in for 4. He exhaled for 6 and let a night visit D4 like a neighbor. The squares settled. Obedient to geometry, even when rooms were not, the staffer hovered at the edge of the frame with a tablet that had learned to glow without being invited. Hair draft caption read, "Kindness in competition." Then, "Mentorship at work." Neither felt like what the board insisted on saying. She scrolled, found a note from press, angle, generosity under pressure. Her stylus hovered the way a lie does right before it understands it needs help. The boom mic floated out and reconsidered. Elise stepped into its shade with the casual accuracy of someone who knows where light forgets to behave. The operator pretended the silk had done the blocking, and not a person. "Play center." Veronica offered the room, like a host setting out fruit. She shifted a pawn toward a future that had already closed. The move said, "Caution," in a language the position did not honor. Leo touched a rook and left it. He slid the queen along the dark squares, with a movement too small for caption. Lines leaned, and the C-file became less a road and more a hinge. The hinge worked because the frame held. You could hear that truth in the far door's quiet complaint. You could see it in the way the pieces stopped disagreeing with one another. A donor near the mantel whispered, "He's in trouble," meaning the boy, meaning the narrative. Arthur said nothing. Elisa said, "Count," and the word hung over the board like a weather advisory you'd be a fool to ignore. Veronica checked the glass, centered the ring out of sight, and lifted her chin as if height could argue with math. 20, she said, bright and breathless. If he makes me jump, the room laughed again, smaller. It sounded like a faucet shutting off in stages. The guard at the arch shifted his stance in time with the wire's hum, and did not know why it mattered that he did. Leo advanced a pawn, one square, as if laying a coin on a counter for a bus fare. It didn't look like a thread in the frame. It looked like a promise kept later. The quartet slid into a figure that felt like walking in rain you cannot see. It made the chandelier glass tinkle as if frost had an opinion. In the kitchen, a dish knocked another and apologized in ceramic. Miles watched the donor cluster split like a cell. One group filmed the hostess's angle, the other filmed results. Her mouth didn't smile, but the corners adjusted as if to better hear the clock. Veronica's chief of staff gathered a knot of junior staff near the console. 2 more cameras on the host, she said, and wrote, "Pledge cadence," on a pad she would later fold into a pocket and forget to wash. Her stylist tapped a rhythm that belonged to a different game. Leo's rook came to C4. It looked like a brace. It felt like a door agreeing with its frame. "Isn't that tight?" a donor asked, tone searching for expertise among strangers. "It's what happens when you ignore the fire exit," Arthur said. He regretted nothing about the sentence once it arrived. Veronica slid her queen 2 squares, as if only 2 squares could save the look she wanted to remember. It guarded a story. It abandoned a square. Elise folded her arms and let her knuckles press white. Under her breath, "We can fund rooms or cameras." Arthur let the thought pass through his chest, like weather that had been named but not heeded. "Phone's bust. $25K if she wins it back. Are we filming this right? Who is the kid? Does he belong to the program?" The staffer typed, "In spirit," and wanted to delete the entire keyboard. She glanced at Rosa, whose hands had found one another again at the seam, as if prayer were a seamstress's work. Leo slid the rook to C7. It sounded like a latch deciding to cooperate after weeks of sulk. The second rook still waited, patient, an understudy who already knew his blocking. Veronica's smile held. "A bright shelf. Marvelous," she said. Her bishop retreated with dignity, a cape hiding a limp. Leo didn't chase the limp. He tightened the hinge, one tucked behind the first. Like a decision that had rehearsed, the file didn't close against white. It closed for the truth. The wire sang a thinner note and then settled. The hinge at the far door sighed once in sympathy. The chandelier cooled to the color of an argument you've stopped losing to. Lincoln 30. A donor tried, reading the room for permission to be larger than himself. 30. Veronica agreed, glittering like a promise you put on layaway. She set the glass down exactly center, and the ring obeyed its concealment. Elise looked at the ring and then at Miles. Miles looked at the ring and then at the board. Both women made the same face a breath apart, a small, private wince for systems that prefer circles to squares. Leo checked the queen's seam. He put it on F3. It changed the sound of the room by a degree you couldn't prove but could live inside. The chief of staff's tablet pinged. "Press asks." "Boy arrogant." She typed, measured, and felt it land like a coin in a jar marked "Someday." Her thumb hovered over "Post" and couldn't find the courage to pay attention to itself. The guard rolled his weight off his right foot and onto his left. It improved his view of the rook alignment by 1 inch. He didn't know chess, but he knew scaffolding when he saw it. Veronica's rooks tightened side by side like power cords coiled for travel. They had nowhere to go that didn't end in proof. Her queen stared hard at a line already owned. A boy bussing plates paused to watch and forgot to breathe. A server recentered a votive that had decided to drift. A donor shut his camera off and pretended it was because of battery. Leo made a move that wasn't beautiful. Tlee. The word infiltration wasn't said. Again, the square had the voice. The room tried to refill itself with chatter and failed. A few syllables broke and slid away like eggs off a hot pan. The quartet held the note that sounded like a hallway becoming a tunnel. Veronica's smile held because smiles can do that longer than people think. She looked at the chief of staff, who looked at the donors, who looked at the caption, which looked back like a mirror trained to compliment. She tasted metal on the back of her tongue and took a sip to turn it into citrus. Elise's phone buzzed. Pausing pledge is premature. She turned it face down and left it to search the table for something that wasn't performance. Her fingers found the ring under glass and stopped nearby. Not touching, not forgiving. Any chance of a reset? A donor asked softly, halfway a plea, halfway PR. Result, Miles said, comfortable with the floor under the word. She didn't look at Veronica when she said it. She looked at the boys bussing plates. Leo didn't prolong. He moved like a man finishing a chore he enjoys. Reek 1 slid into place, and the corridor became a fact you could write on a permit. The wire hummed once more and quieted. The hinge gave up speaking. The quartet resolved the figure without applause. Isn't there the donor tried? And let the sentence die of natural causes. Arthur released a breath that had been holding him up like a brace. Elise let her hand leave his sleeve. It left a faint warmth behind. Veronica's rooks stood in their perfect lines like newel posts on a stair that had been declared unsafe. Her queen could guard pictures or positions, but not both. She picked the camera. The board shrugged. Leo placed his fingertips on the table and counted to 3. He didn't smile. He looked at the diagonal, the hinge, the wire, the men pretending generosity on their phones, and he remembered what rooms do when you ask them to tell the truth. He moved a small piece and made the room feel the size it is. No speech, just squares agreeing with each other. Above them, crystal breathed. Inside the wall, wire settled. At the arch, a guard stood with his weight where it belonged. The light inside the chandelier thinned to an honest blue. Glass went from flattering to factual. Somewhere behind plaster, the wire took a slow breath and held it. Leo rested his hand on the table, palm cool to walnut. He counted 1, 2, 3. Because counting is what you do when noise begs for narrative. Then he fit the last bar into place the way a locksmith tests a bolt he cut himself. Silence did the announcing. It climbed the legs of the furniture and sat. People felt for words like pockets and came up with lint. Veronica blinked. Fast and not enough. Her smile stayed the kind you pin to a dress and trust to look like sincerity. She moved her queen a single neat square, as if precision could barter with physics. Arthur's mouth made a small O that never left his teeth. Elise let her hand find the back of a chair, not for balance, for evidence. The guard at the arch stood with his weight where it belonged and didn't know chess, only scaffolding. Exhibition rules? A donor ventured, brave in the way people are after the building stops shaking. Allow for a reset. His voice admired itself, and then heard its echo. Miles didn't turn her head. Result, she said, as if the word had been true before language learned to name it. The quartet let their bows hover in halfway and then settled, a tiny communal nod to gravity. Veronica's lungs remembered performing. Let's make it teachable. She offered the room, soft and silver. She reached to straighten a rook that did not need her. Leo did not look up. He laid the queen on F3 without noise or gesture. The diagonal tightened, soft as a drawstring, and 2 possible futures collapsed. To one with the courtesy of adults closing doors. A boom mic drifted, hungry for a line that could excuse the day. Elise stepped into its shallow shadow and gave it hem instead of consonants. The operator dropped his eyes to tape on the floor that had been meant for beauty. not testimony. The chief of staff's tablet buzzed with a suggestion labeled healing language, a growing moment for all. She typed context and deleted it, then wrote community and deleted that, then closed her hands into fists around the stylus until it forgot how to glow. The taller HR person cleared her throat with a neat, laminated sound. "If we could," she began, pointing vaguely toward the door as if doors were her department. Miles raised a finger the size of a comma. The sentence changed its mind and waited. Veronica looked for a smile that hadn't been used yet. She located one that made her lips thin and her eyes bigger. The kind that sells truce without making it. "Sweetheart," she told the boy, "show us another line. It will be better for everyone." He looked at the squares and not at her. He breathed in for 4, out for 6, and put the rook where Math had kept a chair open. It wasn't sharp. It was certain. A donor rapped knuckles lightly against a glass and then stopped when the sound came back like a knock on wood. Arthur lifted his phone and silenced it after the first buzz, then palmed it as if heat lived there. Elise watched his hand, then Veronica's, then Rosa's. Rosa held herself still, the stillness of someone who has learned. There are kinds of falling. You can stop with breath. She did not touch the tote with the envelope and the badge. She watched the boy until her eyes watered from not blinking, then blinked and let the water pass for polish. "Fast," someone whispered near the mantel. "Prepared," Leo answered, not to them, to the position. He brushed a knuckle against his own wrist to remind Skin who it works for. Veronica eased a rook 1 square, as if moving was the same as improving. It blocked a picture. It didn't fix the exit. Leo's queen adjusted one last angle by a single file. It changed the temperature of the room by 1/2 degree. Across the way, a votive flame trained itself to be still. "Now," said a donor who liked conclusions. "Now what?" "Now nothing," Arthur murmured, and felt the truth use his mouth. The chandelier clicked once, not for effect. The sound metal makes cooling after a performance it didn't audition for. The wire inside the wall took another thin breath. The hinge down the hall didn't try to speak this time. "Rematch," Veronica said, choosing volume where she had run out of angles. "We'll set a clock. We had time," Miles said, and the sentence sat down with a weight that did not ask permission. The chief of staff tried again. "We could frame this as a..." "No," Elisa said, gentle and stainless. "The way you speak to a friend holding a knife by the wrong end." Leo looked at his mother. She gave him a nod that contained mornings, coins, a library card, and the shape of a spine. He set his queen down on a square that didn't make noise, and ended the part where anyone else had a say. Checkmate doesn't need to shout. It inhabits. People feel their attention change temperature and stand very still so nothing spills. No one clapped. The quartet did not try to rescue the moment with a clever scale. On the sideboard, a bottle settled one bubble under its punt and decided to keep it. Veronica's smile arrived late and broke in her hands. It didn't drop. It thinned until it wasn't a thing anymore. Her tongue touched the back tooth where the metal taste had begun and found citrus working at it like a mild soap. A donor near the piano coughed into a fist and handed himself back his own discomfort. Another lifted a glass he didn't want and discovered it was heavier now. Arthur took a breath, as if surfacing. Elise exhaled like a promise that had finished the work it could do. The taller HR person reopened the envelope to confirm its contents. As if paper could flee, signature received, she noted, handwriting perfect from practice. Page surrendered. She glanced at the clip again and felt, briefly, like a locksmith in a city that refuses to change its locks. The guard at the arch looked at Rosa, and lifted his chin a fraction. It wasn't permission, it was recognition. His radio buzzed, and he turned the volume down in a gesture so small it would never appear in minutes. Veronica found a remnant of her performance voice. "I don't accept it," she said, airy, almost playful. "A member of the class that confuses preference with rule, something's wrong with it's right with the board," Miles said. Her glass sat where a coaster had been waiting to be useful. No ring formed. The chief of staff showed Veronica the tablet like a child shows a parent a drawing that might improve the day. A teachable evening, generosity in tension. The draft looked like linen. It felt like gauze over an old wound. "Post," Veronica said automatically, then hesitated, then said later, and in the space between those two syllables a small bridge collapsed. Elise's phone buzzed on cue from a thread that had grown too crowded to ignore. Pausing pledge is premature. Lit again. She turned the screen face down as if light should be ashamed. Leo slid a piece back to center the geometry. Because adults clean up, he didn't offer his hand. He didn't deny it either. He waited until someone remembered that games end with touching. If people have learned how to use their hands, Veronica stared at his hand, as if trying to identify the tool. She extended hers. It shook because hands sometimes confess what mouths won't. "Good game," Leo said. "No triumph, only the shape of respect." The words gave the room a chance to pick a side between dignity and denial. A few people took it. A few didn't. Most waited to see which would be on camera. Rosa stepped forward one pace. Exactly the pace a person takes toward a child who is not a child anymore. She didn't touch him. She stood where he could be found and let the room learn the difference between witness and audience. Security. The chief of staff began in a whisper that imagined itself discreet. The guard's chin rose a centimeter. Miles said, "That won't be necessary." And it wasn't. A donor tried again. Humbler. "Perhaps an exhibition tomorrow." Elise has said, without cruelty. There was an exhibition tonight. The chandelier's last warm filaments surrendered. Crystal went honest all the way through. The ceiling returned to being a ceiling after a long evening pretending to be a sky. Veronica repositioned a rook by half a hair for the posture of it. The ring under the glass was still hidden, and now that everyone had watched her practice hiding, somehow louder, she rested her fingers on the table and let them be still. "Thank you for your service," the HR woman repeated to Rosa. Sentence laminated at the edges. Rosa nodded once like a person in a courtroom who promises to appear when summoned. She slid the envelope deeper into the tote until paper touched canvas and stopped moving. Arthur finally looked at Elise with his eyes instead of nerves. "This was always a room about rooms," he said. The phrase, "trying to be useful," Elise answered. "Keys," and put her resignation on the table between them without sound. The boy bussing glasses had drifted close. The straps on his apron crossed wrong. He watched the board and then the faces and then his own hand. He straightened the straps behind his back as if that might help. Leo gathered a stray pawn and set it home like a borrowed thing. He looked once at the clock, which rasped a fair second, and let it be. He picked up the black king and held it a heartbeat before setting it down exactly where it had fallen. Veronica's mouth opened on a speech she did not give. She closed it. She lifted her glass, centered it over the ring, and for the first time tonight did not set it down. "School," Leo said to Rosa, as if the word were a vehicle waiting outside. Her mouth softened into something that didn't belong to this room. "We have time," she said, meaning hours you earn, not applause you rent. They turned toward the hall. The hinge remembered itself and made a small, unembarrassed sound. The guard stepped aside with a nod that had the discipline of habit and the courtesy of choice. Behind them, someone finally found applause. Scattered and unconvincing, the quartet declined to accompany it. Miles set her glass on the coaster again, and the wood stayed clean. Veronica stood very straight without realizing it. She watched the door recover its quiet and saw her reflection in the glass like a truth that would not run. She lifted the glass, looked at the hidden ring, and held the weight without a sip. Checkmate was over. The word remained, and in the shape it left, the room met itself. Morning came square and pale. Light cut the kitchen table into tidy halves. The crooked 7 on the microwave clock glowed the same stubborn green it always did when a night had not, in fact, changed the world. Leo's phone vibrated against wood. A link pinned itself to the screen with a caption that believed it, Mentorship Night. A young talent's bravado inspires extra giving. The cut jumped on his move, skipped her mistakes, and trimmed his silence into swagger that looked good on donors. He watched it once without sound. Mouths smiled where they hadn't. The ring on the walnut table hidden yesterday showed in the reflection on a wine glass, and for 3 frames the stain outsold the story that tried to cover it. Another notification climbed the screen. A screenshot of an email, make it teachable. Below it, a thread of timestamps, and a subject line urging optics, not truth, and a forward chain that made the wire inside his ribs hum. He set the phone down face first. Air settled in the apartment the way dust learns a windowsill. Rosa poured coffee that had a small dark ring already forming around the lip of a chipped mug. Clinic at 10. Leo said. His voice made room for nerves and work. He opened the laptop, lifted it on 2 cookbooks to meet his eyes at the horizon, and checked that the camera showed wall, not the peel on the paint. The fan inside the machine hummed like a wire behind plaster. He built the meeting link with a waiting room and a password that made sense if you knew him. He wrote, "Look, count, breathe, hands clean," in a text file and pinned it to the edge of the screen where he could see it and leave it alone. At 9:56, the rectangles arrived. Some were faces, some were ceilings. One was the inside of a bus, where a pole cut the frame like a rook. The librarian waved from behind scratched plexiglass, and a cattail crossed a kitchen island, like punctuation you don't argue with. Audio check, Leo said. He kept his shoulders low and his jaw quiet. Type hi in chat if you can't hear me. A square popped open from a shelter rec room with a TV yelling a game show in the corner. A kid with hair he'd cut himself leaned into the frame. "My board's missing a bishop," he said, showing a hand-drawn stand-in taped to a pawn like a splint that believed in its own medicine. "We can play with that," Leo said. He screen-shared a board and kept his fingers off the touchpad. The fan in the laptop breathed steady, and the wall of faces lopsided. Awkward. Waiting grew into a room he could use. At 10:04, the usernames changed shape. Mentor Hub Official dropped in without waiting room and typed in caps. Then 3 more handles with brand new avatars appeared and pasted a paragraph that smelled like rotten eggs and old hair. The chat snapped bright and ugly. A kid flinched and lowered his camera. The librarian's eyes went hard and private, and then sympathetic. A person who has learned how to step between someone and a bus without getting hit. "Minji," Leo said, already clicking participants. "Peel them to breakout Z." His hands didn't hurry, his voice didn't climb. He slid trolls into a quiet room and muted them like you move broom handles back where they belong. "Kadeem," he said, breath even across the mic. "Lock chat to host only for a minute." The grid shivered as the rules shifted, and the kids who came to learn looked at him like he had handed them oxygen instead of a trick. He counted to 4 on one hand. out to 6 on the other. Back in, he said, and the line held openers today. One that looks loud but isn't, and one that looks quiet but turns the lights off. The librarian held up a plastic set like a priest with bread. The boy in the bus aisle turned his board upright and braced against gravity. In a kitchen square, a mother slid a plate of pancakes under the camera and mouthed, "Eat," and her kid made a face at the screen that said later, "Start with this," Leo said, moving a pawn on the shared board without touching anything in the room. He didn't say names like dragon. He said things like comb and door. He showed how a rook becomes more honest when you don't ask it to be dramatic. A new notification crouched in the corner of his phone screen. Cut video trending. He let it ring itself out and stay small, while his cursor tracked a diagonal, and a boy in a hoodie found out what it feels like when your plan reaches across the street and shakes your hand. Question, a girl said from the quiet of a parked car. If you freeze, what's the move? He tapped the desk once with a nail and said, breathe, touch nothing. C3. Move 1. A rectangle of hardwood and high art appeared on a different screen across town. Arthur hunched at the end of a contract table the size of a small state. Elise sat straighter and let a phone buzz itself tired. Her resignation already sent and folded in her outbox like a pressed leaf. A boardroom speakerphone bloomed a voice they both knew. Pausing pledge is premature. Arthur closed his eyes because the table smelled like lemon oil and old decisions, and that combination is not a hospital but feels like one. Optics Monday, someone said on the line. Context packet going live. Elise picked up her bag and set it down again, then faced the window, where a faint ring stained a side table near a single orchid that pretended to open. She reached, instinctively, to center a cup over it. Her hand stopped an inch above the wood. She let the ring show and watched it darken a little, the way honesty does when it stops hiding and breathes. Arthur scrolled a message from a name he feared and admired. You promised to pause. He typed, "We are reviewing by.com," and erased it and typed, "We are listening," and erased that too because listening without action is the opposite of the verb. Back on the grid, Minji returned to the main room and dropped a thumbs up in chat. Kadeem posted, "We're good," and turned the setting back to everyone. The wave of noise never came back, and the wire inside the laptop sounded like a steady sigh. Mid-lesson, Leo said, marking a small L shape on the screen. He ran a tactic, once slow, once fast, once at the pace of a breath held, because a hallway is crowded. Faces leaned forward into cameras that had been made to witness other kinds of rooms. A boy in a library corner raised his hand with 2 fingers. What if the other person is mean? Keep your hands clean, Leo said. Shake. Say, good game. Ask to see the move where you were wrong. What if they laugh? The boy pushed. Then you win twice, Leo said. You left with your hands clean. The rectangles nodded in different rhythms. He ended with the ritual he decided was a law. See you next Saturday morning. Same link. New password. He killed the meeting and the grid went out like a city block finding night. Silence made a shape over the small room. The laptop fan trailed off, and the wire quieted, and the hinge on the apartment door remembered itself and squeaked once when Rosa came back in. Interview, she said, holding a tote that had learned to carry paper without complaint. Hotel on Western, night shift. She smoothed a slip with the address and a line that said, bring ID and patience. The service corridor smelled of citrus cleaner and steam. Alma, the supervisor, met them with a clipboard and a tired smile that had earned itself. Shoes, she asked, and Rosa looked at her flats like they were an audition and nodded when Alma nodded back. They rolled past a laundry room that hissed in consonants. A cart creaked a single hinge that had decided to be honest with strangers. Corners diagonal, Alma said, palming a sheet and tucking it like a magician who respects geometry more than applause. Rosa matched the fold after watching once. Her hands found a rhythm the fabric approved. They moved together through a bathroom where the mirror bore 1,000 polite fingerprints, and a sink had a salt ring that no polish would lift. Log everything, Alma said, tapping a clipboard grid that had the dignity of a clean spreadsheet. Room number time, found item, badge in, badge out. She showed Rosa where the time clock printed numbers that would decide who owed who a minute. A line cook wheeled past with a tray of rolls. Steam smelled like wheat and the end of a shift. Rosa wrote, Room 6, 22. Mirror. Ring cleaned. Shirye. Shirba. And underlined it once, because someone would read it later. And she wanted the sentence to hold. Her phone buzzed twice in the pocket. She wasn't allowed to check on the floor. She let it. The hinge in her chest squeaked like an old door, and then eased, oiling itself on purpose. At a desk under fluorescent light, a woman with a plastic nameplate took Rosa's ID. The fixture flickered once, then steadied, and the room's hum settled like weather that had learned to stay. Benefits in 90 days, the woman said. PTO accrues. Badge Friday. Thank you, Rosa said. She didn't smile. She took air and set it down carefully. She signed one line with a pen chained to the desk, then another, then lifted her eyes when the cartwheel squealed again, like an unkindness they could fix. In a building where the air was conditioned to a consistent version of the day, a small conference call wrapped around itself. The board decided to move forward through words that never had to carry luggage. Arthur closed his laptop and looked at Elise like she was the only person in the room who could read a clock without a caption. Keys, Elise said. She lifted her bag the way a person picks up what they can carry of their life. She left her access card on the table without the drama of a sound. By evening, the cut video had climbed the feeds and settled. Someone leaked the draft email with timestamps that belonged to different weather. A long thread below argued over bravado, context, policy, and proof, and none of it moved upon. Leo sat with a bowl of rice. He set the spoon down and let the quiet touch his forearm. He opened the laptop and labeled a folder, Clinic, and slid a screenshot of the grid inside, as if organizing a life could be a kind of prayer. Rosa came in smelling like bleach and mint and warm bread. She dropped keys into a bowl that pinged a single true note. They liked the corners diagonal, she said, and put her badge receipt on the table where he could see. It wasn't a badge yet, and would be soon. He nodded once and offered the bowl. They ate without talking because talking is heavy after certain days. The hinge on the window caught and squealed. He stood and put a drop of oil where metal kissed metal and tried again until the sound turned into a breath. The phone vibrated face down. He let it. On the table, a library card sat under a salt shaker, and the ring beneath the glass wasn't hidden, and no one tried to center anything over it. The library opened like a throat clearing. Fluorescence blinked once, then thought better of it. A carpet runner held the chill from last night and released it in slow, even breaths. Patty at circulation had tape on 2 fingers and a Band-Aid on the third. She slid a clipboard forward with institutional calm. Microgrant is paused, she said, pausing exactly where the email had due. Reputation review. She let the phrase sit there until it grew embarrassed. Leo looked at the stack of plastic chess kits behind scratched plexi. The boxes wore old barcodes and good intentions. Can kids still check them out? He asked. Because procedures break differently than people think. Policy says new inventory moves, Patty said, then lowered her voice until it matched the hum from the server closet. I say audit me later. She stamped 3 cards with the authority of a small republic and slid the kits across under the plexiglass notch. A boy with a denim backpack shifted his weight foot to foot. His breath fogged a thumbnail oval on the barrier. Do we have to sign something different? He asked. Careful like you are with doors that swing back. Initial here, Patty said, tapping a line with a chewed pencil. Return by Tuesday. No pieces in pockets. If you lose a night, you owe us a story. The kid smiled because a story is lighter than a fine. Leo carried 2 kits to a table with a laminate edge, the color of pale gum. He set them down and checked the corners like Alma had taught his mother. The board unfolded on felt, a rectangle resolving into 64 squares that asked for nothing louder than attention. You're the boy from the video, a man said from the periodicals rack, not unkind, not certain. Maybe, Leo said. He centered the tripod for a quick instruction clip. The ring light refused to obey, so he settled for window light. And let the room be honest. Short lesson. He told a camera that did not care. Rooks like clear hallways. Bishops need diagonals that lead somewhere. Knights are for getting past what people assume. He spoke like he was fixing a hinge, not reading a poem. The light held steady. Down the row, a printer coughed up a job and chewed the first page. Patty tugged the paper out with a practiced wrist twist and a whispered curse that would have offended no one in a church. By afternoon, the round table assembled in a downtown room with glass walls and a view of indifferent traffic. The air had that not quite citrus hotel smell that promises clarity and delivers HVAC. A placard read, Keys and Locks. Access Summit. The ampersand leaning like it had been up late. Senator Miles arrived without entourage and sat where she could see both the whiteboard and the thermostat. Her aide parked a tablet, a legal pad, 3 pens, in silence. Across from them, a civic tech developer arranged a deck whose cover made the word sponsored look like a compliment. We can offer sponsored access, the developer said, sliding the first card forward. Device vouchers, branded routers, subsidies data, names you know. He smiled the smile of a man who has wrangled bandwidth and donors long enough to confuse the two on purpose. Signage. Then, Miles said, motion no larger than the tilt of a glass. We asked for keys. She wore the kind of restraint that feels like a belt on a blade. It's a bridge. He tried. It's a billboard, she answered. Her aide uncapped a pen and wrote, Billboards différents de d'or, and underlined the not equals until the paper dented. Leo waited for his turn, hands flat on the table, counting to 4 and out to 6 because professional rooms breathe too fast. When kids see a sponsor on the front of the room, they think the room belongs to the sponsor. He said, when they see a door that opens without a camera, they think it belongs to them. A woman from facilities rotated a keyring heavy as a minor planet. She slid a brass cylinder from a sandwich bag and rolled it across her palm. We can recore 2 branches this quarter, she said. It's not nothing. It's not enough. 2 doors and a posted code, Miles said, marking checkboxes that existed only in her head and would exist elsewhere by Monday. After-hours study rooms that don't require a parent's utility bill. She did not smile. She wrote times, dates, badge turn windows. The developer re-angled his deck toward Leo. We also have cameras, he said, with the bright tone of a man presenting a vitamin. Safe corridors, moderated spaces. If a place watches, it behaves. Sometimes it performs Leo said. He watched the window's reflection of Miles's pen, the way the ink made tiny hinges between words. Doors don't ask for applause. A catering cart squeaked in with coffee and fruit. The hinge on the conference room door protested once, then surrendered to oil in the track. Leo took water. Miles took black coffee. The developer chose the fruit with the brand sticker facing camera, and didn't realize he had. In the evening light, the library's plexiglass looked like someone had tried to polish honesty into it and settled for function. Patty checked a barcode out to a girl whose fingers bore calluses from violin or dishwater or both. "Bring it back clean," she said, and the kid said, We included more than the two of them." At the hotel, a cart rolled on its good wheel, and its bad. Rosa and Alma worked a rhythm the rooms respected. "Corners diagonal," Alma said, not because Rosa needed telling, but because mantras turn hours into steps. They paused by a window, whose crank handle stuck at 90 degrees. Alma dabbed a pencil eraser at a rust spot that had been trying to be a hole. Rosa turned the handle back and forth until the squeal learned to be a whisper. "People always think the sound means something's wrong," Alma said. "Sometimes a hinge just remembers it's metal." They laughed, dry and brief, the kind of laugh that keeps knees working. Near the ice machine, a bulletin board held notices with straight pins and crooked truths. Dental plan information. Staff soccer sign-ups. Uno tournament. Bring your own cards. Rosa wrote, "Clinic Saturdays. Ask for link," on a sticky, and pressed it where people actually look while waiting for ice. She smoothed the corners like you bless a hope. Late afternoon turned the city to brass. Leo took the bus down Western with the kits strapped tight. Two teens sitting backward shared one earbud and a bag of chips, the salt shining like small stars on their fingers. He got off at Pico and walked to a park with cambium yellow sycamores. A fold-out table became a classroom. Kids in zip-ups and uniforms and work shirts gathered like a constellation that hadn't been named yet, and was fine with that. "Half-hour openers," he said. "Then tactics. Then you beat me twice and we end on a handshake." He looked up at the light and placed the board so it wouldn't glare. Kadim arrived with a milk crate of taped-up sets and the brisk competence of a man who keeps systems alive. Minji brought dry erase markers and a sandwich she would forget to eat. Patty's nephew came with a stack of index cards that read, "Rook equals hallway," in block letters and placed them under elbows like quiet captions. A city employee wandered over with a clipboard and a logo on a windbreaker. "You the permit?" he asked, eyeing the table like it owed him property tax. "You the part," Leo said. The man grinned despite himself and checked a box that could have gone the other way. "Phones in a pile," Leo told the group, tapping a Tupperware he'd set on the table. "Hands clean." They groaned and complied, and discovered it made the day longer in a good way. A kid in a work shirt asked, "What if I can't come next week?" "Bring your brother," Leo said, "or your neighbor, or your mom." He nodded at a woman lifting a toddler onto a hip with a practice scoop. "We take witnesses." They played until the sun turned metal. A small boy made a legal night fork and covered his mouth to keep a scream from breaking the evening. A teenager lost a queen and did not ask for a reset. He asked to see the move where he was wrong and wrote it on his own hand. "Clinic's over," Leo said. When the streetlights warmed, "Put boards back in the crate. Trade a handshake for a lesson you liked." The pile of phones went back to pockets without anyone pretending relief. On the walk home, he stopped under a flickering sign at a taqueria. The light stuttered through 3 vowels before finding itself. Inside, a cook salt-sweated and smiled, like a man who liked his knives. The TV over the counter ran a segment that combined generosity and a montage, and got the verbs wrong. Leo watched until he recognized the building and the chandelier and a caption that used bravado like a napkin. He took his food to go and let the door close on a scene that didn't need him. At the apartment, the bowl on the shelf took keys, like it had been made for that. Rosa came in a minute later, hair damp at the temples and a clean tired in her shoulders. They set food out and ate with elbows on the table like people who had earned their plates. Alma says we'll get badges Friday, she said. Printer was down. She smiled without showing teeth. We used a paper log. The old ways still work. Leo opened his laptop and dragged a folder into clinic, then into week 2, then into kits. Return. He labeled files with date times, initials, and one extra letter that meant we kept our promise. He closed the lid and listened to the fan trail off like a wire cooling after doing its job without applause. By the sink, a glass sat on a faint ring. No soap would lift. No one centered anything over it. The window hinge gave a soft, familiar noise and then quieted, as if the apartment had learned their rhythm. On the bedside table, a library card lay under a salt shaker like a good luck charm that also made sense. The city hummed through the wall, a low grid of old wires. Finding a way, in the hall, someone's door clicked into latch with the satisfaction of a well-set rook. In the morning there would be emails. In the week there would be votes. Tonight they had squares and a hinge that worked, and rooms they could enter without permission. The waiting room kept the AC 2 degrees colder than apology. Light fell from a grid into smooth squares on the carpet. A printer behind the receptionist ticked and warmed and produced a page with the kind of font that suggested it had never been late to anything. Alvarez, the receptionist said, without looking up from a screen that fed on rectangles. Conference B. Her lanyard badge swung and flashed a barcode like a small, obedient leash. Leo rubbed his palms on his jeans and counted to 4. He breathed out for 6 and watched the doors hinge. Remember how to work? Across the hall, a water cooler burbled one thick syllable, then sealed itself like a secret with no audience. 2 interviewers looked up when he entered. One wore a tie with diagrams of bridges. The other wore a sweater with the diplomacy of oatmeal. A third square in the room was a tablet propped on a stand for the dean, who had mailed in to avoid traffic and would ask for candor like a password. Thanks for coming, the bridge tie said, hands clasped, so the knuckles made a roof. Water. No thanks, Leo said, because thirst is another game people bring to rooms. They began with nouns, classes he liked, books he read, where the library kept the chess books that had more fingerprints than their checkout numbers suggested. He answered in verbs, count, build, file, breathe. Tell us about a failure, the sweater said, with the softened smile of a man who has practiced hearing 5 kinds. I rushed, Leo said, in a game and in a room. Either way, you missed doors that were unlocked. A notification stuttered across the tablet's lower corner, and the dean swiped it away. The tablet's camera glinted like an eye that remembered sunlight. In the moment after the swipe, the dean's reflection showed a faint ring on a desk. He hadn't had time to wipe. Bridge tie shifted to the question they were supposed to wait to ask. We've seen a clip, he said, careful with each syllable. Edited. You looked triumphant. He kept the ellipsis like a hand on a shoulder that could turn into pressure. Leo let the silence stand on its own leg. He looked down at the seam on his knuckle, and then at the seam in the table veneer. I was relieved, he said. I had prepared. The sweater lifted a pen and drew nothing. Context, he said, the way doctors say history before they touch a chart. We prefer chain of custody to applause. Leo nodded once. There's the version where a caption frames a room that never asked to be a painting. He kept his voice level. And the version where a board records what Squares said when no one wanted to write it down. Bridgetia almost smiled. We're engineers, he said. We like loads more than line. He flicked to a page titled Need-Based Prince Merit Prince Life on Topography, and tapped grid like a man proud of his smaller math. Why here? The dean asked through the tablet. A clean voice from a speaker that also hissed. I need rooms I don't have to perform for, Leo said. He let his hands rest on the table and watched their shadows learn to behave. The sweater flipped a sheet and found his last question printed in a font that did mercy for nobody. What's a door? He asked, trying not to sound like a man who had been in glass rooms all his life. Something not made of cameras, Leo said. Something you can fix with a hinge and a hand. They thanked him the way rooms do when they are not the courtroom and not the kitchen and still want to believe in bread. Decision emails by end of week, Bridgetia said. He stood, and the chair made a small equal sign against the carpet that didn't rub out when he left. Outside, the corridor smelled like lemons and toner. He passed 2 closed rooms, and one with the lights off and an unpicked lock. The elevator breathed, descended, and let him step into a lobby, pretending to be a plaza. Across town, a salon opened its doors to a certain kind of healing. Velvet chairs arranged themselves to look spontaneous. A sign at the entrance asked for phones on silent, and then suggested a hashtag in 2 tasteful fonts. Veronica stood just inside the frame where a camera could fall in love again. She wore forgiveness like a loaned coat. The ring on the walnut table waited beneath a coaster that looked big enough to hide a city ordinances page. We are here to listen, she said to the room and the microphone. 6 inches from her mouth, we are here to grow. Her chief of staff nodded with the ghost of sleep deprivation and held a stack of cue cards like bandages that had missed the wound. Donors clustered by candles, the color of softened butter. A junior reporter adjusted a tiny tripod and tried to look small. In the corner, a string duo tuned to a hum that found the wire in the walls and negotiated a truce. Center the glass. Someone whispered at her shoulder. Habit moved before thought, and Veronica obeyed. The coaster swallowed the ring the way language tries to swallow facts when guests begin arriving in good shoes. She began with an anecdote. Grandfathers, Sunday boards, the music of pieces on wood that no one kept score of. It made the right faces soften. It made the wrong faces bite their cheeks. A donor raised a hand like a student, learning what hands are for. Will the foundation sponsor a Young Mentors series? Veronica smiled in the direction of the living. We will consider, she said, which is what power says when it wants to keep dessert. Across the room, Arthur stood near a bookcase and failed to steady his breath. Elise was not present. Her access card was on a table 2 miles away, under a letter that scooped out the words she had spent on rooms like this. He watched the glass hover over wood and saw the ring through the coaster somehow anyway. The junior reporter cleared her throat. Question, she said, cheeks colored by duty and a bus ride. When you say teachable, what does the tape say? The room changed temperature by a degree. Cameras remembered they were on and tried to look natural. The chief of staff steadied the cue cards and dropped one. It exposed a printout of timestamps that didn't match a posted schedule. Veronica smiled harder. I've learned, she said, putting both hands on the edge of the table with ritual weight. We all have. We'll use this to do more. The junior reporter didn't move. She pointed her phone at the wood and took a photo of the coaster covering the ring. The flash did not fire. The picture still found the stain under the thing, pretending not to be there. Arthur stepped away. the feeling in his chest now shaped like a hinge that refuses to forgive WD-40. "I need air," he told no one who mattered, and left through a door that celebrated itself in a spray of cold perfume. Two donors followed, laughing about dinner, the sound like utensils packed in a drawer all at once. The salon tried to continue. The string duo slipped into a melody that hated trouble. Veronica picked up the glass and finally set it down off-center, a half-inch stray that showed the ring to anyone still paying attention. Across a smaller city of rooms, the park's sycamores pressed leaves against a clear sky. Kits came back to the library desk with a piece missing here, a story scrawled on an index card there. Patty stamped dates with the calm of a person who knows stamp sounds beat hashtags in the long run. At the hotel, Rosa stood with Alma at a service elevator where someone had taped a "down for maintenance" sign in a handwriting that tried to help. They rolled the cart to the other end and did the floors in a different order. "Corners diagonal," Alma said, "like the Lord's Prayer for people who respect linens." Rosa's phone vibrated once during her 10-minute break. She looked at the screen and then looked at the clock and then slid the phone back because the break wasn't hers yet. She finished the haul and came back and read, "We're pleased to inform you," before the screen dimmed, and she laughed at herself for not touching it enough. Leo reached the apartment when the light was 4 o'clock honest. He set keys in the bowl and watched them rest, the note clean and small. He poured water in a glass that kept a thin ring near its foot, like a halo evolving into a fact. The laptop woke and gave him its face. Emails lined up like soldiers in a kinder army. One had a subject line that did not disguise itself. "Decision. Alvarez." He did not click it. He opened "Clinic" and dragged new files into Week 3 and labeled them with a date, a time, and an initial that meant "we kept our promise again." He checked the library's online catalog and saw 3 kits overdue, and did not mind because people are late more than they are untrue. Then he clicked. Words filled the screen in a serif that assumed steadiness. They congratulated him, mentioned "merit champs need," described a package, specified a reply window with a time stamp, and a time zone he had to do math to respect. He exhaled without knowing he'd held the air. He didn't cheer. He slid the email into a folder named Clinic, and then a subfolder named Keys, then printed it into a PDF, as if a paper trail could be a small, private bridge. Rosa came home with clean tired and a badge receipt. He handed her the printout and watched her read, her mouth doing nothing showy. She touched his cheek with a hand that smelled like wheat and bleach and said, "Good, like a right. Keep a copy with your card," she said. He nodded, slid the paper under the salt shaker, and laid the library card beside it like cousins. They stood and counted to 4 and out to 6 because breathing is free and precise if you do it on purpose. Outside, sirens crossed without touching. A bus hissed and knelt and took on more weather. Somewhere across town, a salon posted a clip of a healing circle that looked like a ring you could center a glass over. In the kitchen, the hinge on the window complained, then let go after a small correction. A draft stroked the edge of the coaster and forgot to move it. The glass stayed off-center by the same stubborn half-inch that had kept the room honest at last. Night stuttered in through the blinds with regular slats. Leo opened the laptop one more time and added a line to a plain text file that only had verbs. Look, count, breathe, teach, fix, return, hold. He left the file open. He clicked the clinic link and scheduled a Saturday with a new password. He wouldn't say out loud until the last second. He checked the permissions on the folder that kept the kids' names and locked it. Rosa set a small bowl of rice on the table and a second for him, and 2 spoons they'd bought at a flea market where the seller told stories for free. They ate and didn't need to name the day. The wall hummed its low wire hum, and the room wore it like a heartbeat. It had decided belonged. A text lit the phone face down and did not get answered. Another followed and joined it in being patient. Some messages don't have to be first to matter. At the end, Leo washed the single glass and set it upside down on a towel. Water gathered and ran in a clean ring that didn't stain. He turned the glass upright and left it uncentered. A small act, a hinge he could fix, and chose not to. He sat. He listened to the building breathe like something that wants to keep standing. The clock on the stove kept its green, honest 7, a little crooked, and nothing in the room tried to straighten it. In the end, this story isn't about chess or headlines. It's about how we meet the quiet tests. Life keeps giving those moments when a room asks us to perform instead of belong. When a closed door dares us to find the hinge. True dignity is not loud. It's the steady choice to keep your hands clean, to breathe, count, and move one honest square at a time. Many of us, especially in our later seasons, know how injustice can settle in like background noise. The cure is not rage for rage's sake, but clear action. Speak up, document, set boundaries, refuse the stage that humiliates, and build rooms people can enter without permission. True gold doesn't fear the fire, and character, tested, becomes our passport. In toxic dynamics, don't bargain with disrespect. Name it, step out, or redesign the rule. What goes around comes around. Yes, but only because enough of us carry the truth forward. The long run tells on everyone. Arrogance caves in. Preparation holds. Justice, in practice, looks like small procedures done faithfully, keys issued, logs kept, voices heard, and like the humility to admit we were wrong and set it right. Diversity isn't a slogan. It's the real fact that talent, grace, and grit show up everywhere if we make space and stop centering the same glass over the same old ring. If this resonated, I'd love to hear your reflections. What door in your life needs a new hinge? Have you faced a room that asked you to shrink, and how did you answer? Share your story in the comments. Tap like if this moved you, and subscribe so you don't miss future pieces that blend drama with reflection. Wishing you a calm evening, a steady breath, and the quiet courage to choose respect, one clean, deliberate move at a time.